Google says we can broadcast for 8 hours. I don't think we'll need that. Um, So Price, thank you again for doing this. I really appreciate you giving us the time, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation, to learning a little bit more about your experiences and how those apply.
Looking back, you can look at my career and see a trajectory. But at the time, as I started out, and for most of it, it wasn't planned. It was more the phone rang, I answered, and I did what people offered me to do. So, but one of the things that happened probably midway through my career was when I was working at the State Department for Secretary Albright, and I was on her staff as what they call an advance person. So before she would go someplace, I would go there and set up her meetings, the bilaterals, events she was going to do, etc. And I'd never done communications, which is, if you look at my career, you think, oh, he's a comms guy. But I'd never done that before that trip. And that was in 1997, I believe, maybe 96, 97. And that was her first trip to Israel as the Secretary of State. And one of the things she was going to do was visit the grave of former Prime Minister Rabin and pay her respects. And what I'd done before that trip is I'd sat in on the meetings with the policy people just to hear what the goals of the trip were. And remember, I'm not a communications person really at the time, I'm just an advanced guy. So I listened to what the goals of the trip were. And one of the goals was to talk about Middle East peace process, maybe try to get the Israelis to make concessions or at least come to the table with the Palestinians. So one of the events I was supposed to do there, as I said, was have set up her visit to pay her respects to former Prime Minister Rabin. And that's when that was my first, I would say, my first communications event. And the goal for me became to get that image of her paying her respects on the front page of the papers in Israel, to give those policymakers who are going to be asking the Israelis for concessions more room to maneuver at the negotiating table with the Israelis. So the idea was to show her paying her respects, and therefore the Israeli population would see that she got it. She understood the challenges they have, the world they live in, the threats their leadership have, even physical threats. And so I asked people, how do you set up a camera shot? How far away do the cameras need to be? How long should the secretary stay at the grave to pay her respects, etc.? And then I briefed the secretary on that. I set up an area for the cameras to be at the site. I walked the route from where the car would drop her to the grave, etc. Anyway, so I did all that and briefed the secretary on what was going to happen. And the next day, in all the papers in Israel, top of the fold, which is how they used to talk about communications in the old days before digital, top of the fold, big image of Secretary Albright paying her respects to former Prime Minister Rabin. And that was my first kind of, I guess I got hooked after that because it worked. So before that, I think comms people, at least for me in my eyes, were something happened, you wrote a press release, and somehow it got published. But I was able to see how my actions on the ground had a direct impact into the possibility of, in this case, the policy goals of senior leadership of the State Department. So you can see that kind of trajectory in everything I've done since. I've tried to be in roles where I could have impact on policy, if it's in government or at a think tank, on a product, if it's at a company like BAE Systems, or for the other clients I've worked at PR firms and with my own firm now. How can I either give the policy and the policymakers more room to succeed? How can I get the product in front of the eyes of the people who need to see it? And nowadays with digital, measure that. I can measure it much better than I ever could in the past.
You said, pick up the phone and take the jobs that come. How did you get into the field in the first place? What sort of led you there?
Well, I was at the State Department. I actually had always wanted to work in foreign affairs and international relations. That had always been my goal. My father worked for a U.S. defense company. We always had foreigners coming to our home. My father believed in sometimes not taking people out to dinner at a restaurant, but bringing them to our home and have them meet the family. And I do that a lot myself now, even too with clients. Try to bring them home to have dinner. And so I met these people, always fascinated with international relations. And so I majored in political science. I got a job at the State Department. What's odd is at the time there was a hiring freeze at the State Department. And when they finally released it, they weren't hiring foreign services officers at the time, only civil servant. So I got a job as a clerk typist at the State Department in 1989, almost the lowest level you could start at the State Department with a college degree. It was the lowest level, and worked my way up. And what I did then is what I've done since, is whatever it takes to get the job done, whatever the job was. Literally, if it was just punching holes in paper to put it in a binder, getting a cable telegram in the old days, memo cleared in the building. By hand walking it around, not just leaving it and then going back to pick it up, but waiting there in front of the person who was supposed to read it and clear it. And people saw that I was willing to do whatever it took to get the job done. And, I've basically done that ever since, no matter what the job was. That event in Israel, getting that image in front of the people in Israel by making sure it was in the papers, really changed my entire trajectory of my career. And after that, I was really hooked on communications, and therefore have fought to have communications always at the table, not just as an afterthought, but as a primary lever that senior leadership in a company or in government or in a think tank can pull in order to obtain their objective and goal, no matter what it is. You can actually, one of the ways I judge a company on how it's going to do or how it's doing is I actually look at the org chart, and where does communication come in there? Where does the head of communications report directly to the CEO, or is there an intermediary, someone in between them? And if there is, I see that as a problem and actually something that would increase risk for that company. If there's that filter between what the CEO is trying to accomplish and the person who can help them accomplish that, I think one of the best ways with communications. And you've seen companies, I think, go away from that, having intermediary between the CEO and the head of communications or marketing or whatever it's called at a company.
Do you see that change when things go wrong? Into crisis communications, do you see people understand that really is the point where communications needs to be front and center?
It does, and therefore that can often highlight a risk itself. So when the crisis happens, and they're like, and if the communications person hasn't always had a seat at the table, if they come in then, you're already behind. So therefore, the communications person doesn't understand the context as well, doesn't understand the personalities at the table as well, and that adds to your risk. If the person has always been there and has always had a seat at the table and a voice that's listened to, there's a famous communications people often use this quote from Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he turns to his head of the U.S. Information Agency to ask him what he can do, and he says in reply, Mr. President, if you want me at the crash landing, it's best to have me at the launch as well. And I always tell folks, I'm not telling you as a communications person you can't build an airplane if that's what you want when it takes off. you've decided to build an airplane, we're building an airplane. But I can give you insight into how that airplane will be perceived, what could happen, what are some of the follow-on effects as you take on this thing to hopefully mitigate against any future risk, which is what other people at the table do, right? So legal and finance, especially legal, right? They're always worried, they're always about risk management, reducing risk. And people often see the communications as the opposite, right? They create risk. And I push back hard on that. I said my job is as well as to reduce risk and increase the chance of success, not increase the chance of failure. The main difference in government, since a lot of the people I worked for, especially the senior people, some had been either politicians or in politics or worked for other politicians in Congress and elsewhere, they understood to a much larger degree the value that communication can bring to a challenge. And the other thing was the big difference is the way each handles risk. So in government, you would wake up each morning literally not knowing what was going to happen that day as far as crisis. And there was a crisis every single day. And so, by 6 a.m. or 7 a.m., you find out a crisis has happened somewhere by noon. So, 5 or 6 hours later, by noon, you had a plan of action, what you were going to say, where you were going to say it, the audience you were trying to reach, the hoped for impact with that statement that was supporting the policy. By noon, cleared throughout the government, sometimes even by the president of the United States, in this case, in the U.S., and the plan was put into action. In the private sector, there's the belief that the private sector is fast and nimble and therefore responds quickly, and the government is the one that's slow. And I found the exact opposite is true. I found the private sector much slower, much more risk averse, in the sense that they almost want all the risk to go away before they would take any action. By the way, even if it's good news. So when I worked in the private sector, and if the company was going for a government contract on something, and the government had awarded the company the contract, and the government had even announced it because they awarded it, and therefore they announced it the same day, i.e. that's that timeline I gave you. They make a decision, hours later, it's acted on. So in the private sector, the announcement comes out from the government, but weeks would go by before they would take any action, before even acknowledge a good news event, because of the implied or assumed risk, even in good news. So the idea was to work out all the risk prior to taking action. Therefore, I saw in the private sector huge missed opportunities for the company, not just to announce maybe this win, but to show that they're a company on the move, that they're doing cutting edge technology, that their people are passionate about what they do, et cetera. And that difference, I had to get used to that difference, going from, ironically, the speed of government to the slow lane of the private sector. I think people in government understand that that the risk is inherent in what they're doing, and they also seem to accept that there's so many things beyond their control that they've decided just to control the things they can, but to control them the best they can. And therefore, the only thing that they can really often control is their own policies, and then how they act upon those policies. Whether it's, remember, communications isn't just words, as you were saying earlier in a press release. It's the actions we take. It's where we take those actions. It's not just giving a speech. Where do you give the speech? Who's behind you? Who's in the audience? What time is the speech? Not just the policy. So all those things go into it, and they know they need to move fast if they're going to drive the conversation. And you do see, I think, more companies accepting that reality. But the government, at least the U.S. government, and most parts of it, have understood for a long time that if you want to drive and control the conversation, you have to lead. And I learned this from the former head of Central Command here in the U.S. military, General Petraeus. He had a saying, although of course he had his own crisis communication challenges. He had a saying, and it's kind of ironic given what he had to go through, was in communications, you needed to be first with the truth. It wasn't good enough just to go out and be first, right? It had to be the truth. Also, you couldn't just go out with the truth if it was too late. It was also, that also wouldn't work. So both had to happen. You had to be first, and it had to be the truth. And then you could control the narrative. What you said there is for companies who do crisis communications well and handle a crisis, the work begins or a lot longer before the crisis. So for communications, of course, I'm always looking for an opportunity in the communication, if it's a company or even in government. But before that happens, you have to have already had relations with the media and established, and they have to be good relations. I mean, human nature, if you treat reporters horribly, that's not good. It's going to come back to you. Even if at the time, this actually often happens in government with communications, media people, because they quote unquote own the senior person. So if a reporter wants an interview with the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State, they have to go through you. Therefore, they think they have all the power. That's not true, of course. And even if they do have some power or influence, it's fleeting. Always have good relations with the media, and today have a well-established and mature digital media presence. Not just social media, but on your website. Today, podcasts, blogs. Make sure you're on all those platforms where your audience is, or any future audience may be, to make sure you're there. And depending on the company, it could even be Instagram and other platforms as well. Because when the crisis happens, you have to have those outlets already there and mature, or no matter what you say, no matter how fast you say it, it's not going to reach the people that need to hear it. That's just the way it is today.
Right.
Both for policymakers in government and for the private sector, for corporations, and even for think tanks, nonprofits as well. Digital communication, social media now allows that two-way conversation to happen much quicker than it ever could before. In the past, you had to wait for the newspaper article to come out to see what the other person was saying about you or your product or your policy. And then you would have to call that reporter and try to get, your story back in, the next day's article, if there was one. Of course, that now happens in seconds and multiple times a day. And corporations, and for a while government, but not anymore, a lot of corporations see risk in that two-way communication, and it scares them about, what are people saying about us on our own platform, right? On a company's own Facebook or Twitter feed. What are other people saying about us? And why would we allow, quote unquote, negative comments to be on our platform? And of course, I disagree with that view of it. As a communications person, both for external, dealing with the outside world, or internal, employee engagement, I love social media. It can serve as an early warning spot to see things if it's your employees, complaining about health benefits. I worked at one company where they were rolling out a new health plan for the company employees called Health Plus. And on the company Facebook page, they started calling it Health Minus because it wasn't actually an improvement they saw to their health care, but a reduction in coverage. And but because of that quote unquote negative conversation going on Facebook, senior leadership in the company therefore had insight into company morale and what the employees were feeling in a way they could never have in the past, until all of a sudden they were losing employees and not knowing why. Now, in a very real sense, in real time, they could see and measure, even if only anecdotally, where the employees were. Same thing externally. You can see comments from current, future, past customers on your product. Once again, in a way you just couldn't in the past. And therefore you can tweak your product or your policy accordingly if it's not working or reaching the people that you want to reach. The other thing you can do is measure it in a way it was impossible to do this in the past. You can now measure success on a policy or a product so much faster than you could in the past. And if it's going to fail, it can fail fast now, and you can therefore move on to something else much quicker than you ever could in the past. And the company doesn't disappear; it just pivots because it doesn't go bankrupt. It just changes its product or its policy to meet the needs of its customer.
Yet, what would you say are the common themes, the common skills or practices that make for good communications, no matter where you're doing it?
I think that the number one skill, and the one that I think that's taken the biggest hit in the last 10 years, is the ability to write well. You have to be able to write well. Even if you're only doing an interview like I am on camera, and there's right now at least, no written words. The ability to write and write well gives you the ability to speak clearly and concisely. The ability to write well gives you the ability to create clear and concise content, even if that's an image. What are you trying to say with that image? It's the same thing. The same process you use when you're trying to write a paragraph about something. Twitter and Facebook, the two of the current big social media platforms. It's hard to imagine something where writing is less important than more important than those two places. Especially Twitter. Even if they expand it to 280 characters, you still have to be able to write clearly and concisely, and hopefully not be misunderstood. Write from a standpoint of your viewers or readers, how they're going to see it. So that's the major and overwhelming one, and the one I think that has taken the biggest hit. You see writing and the ability to write well going down, not going up, and I think that's the biggest challenge. The other thing I think is important is to be flexible, be open for new things, new mediums as they happen. I remember in the early days of the internet and blogs, and even before social media hit, people just couldn't believe that they were going to have to, quote unquote, feed this beast all the time. Be careful what you ask for with a blog, because you'll have to act on it all the time. And I would always ask senior officials for blogs, and then when it became social media. So the question is not whether or not you're going to take part in a blog. You already are. You're just not writing it. Someone else is. So the only question is, do you want to have a say in what's said about you? So that's true. And that, by the way, that's always been true, whether it's in the old days with print, then with blogs and things like that, then with social media or a website, and even on, of course, and then even on the kind of in-between stage with people faxing things around, and then email. But so you have to be open and flexible, which means, by the way, risk, because that's what it all comes down to, is what's your kind of acceptance level for taking a risk with the hope for reward on the other side. And I happen to lean on the side of taking risk that's managed, but take risk in order to get that reward. I think that the main thing I've learned is to before you speak, is to understand the audience you're speaking to. So if an event, a negative event or a perceived negative event has happened and you're in a company and the senior leadership team has come together, often what you see is each function arguing its angle, its stovepipe. So from the finance side, we're going to lose money. From the legal side, we have legal risk here, which could lead to losing money. And the comms people are always arguing we need to get ahead of it, right? And so what I try to do now is when I respond, acknowledge the risk. So not just come from, okay, this is what we need to say, but so make sure the people in the room understand that I have an understanding and knowledge about the risk, about the challenges, and that I see the legal impact that could happen to the company. Therefore, I'm not talking about putting the CEO on 60 Minutes, depending on the issue. And understand the finances, which is why I'm not talking about, right away doing an interview with the Wall Street Journal or calling up our investors. But that here's my, so make sure that my language, by giving my suggested answer, takes into account the fact that often the people at the table see me as more risk. Because for the people in finance and for legal and even the CEO and people in operations, it's impossible to get in trouble for what you say to the media if you never say anything to the media, right? So it's impossible to get in trouble with what you say to the employees if you don't communicate with the employees. Therefore, if I come in with the understanding that that's the foundation, anything I quote unquote get above that, I see as a win. So therefore my expectations are fairly low. But what I also try to do at the same time is make sure they understand the risk of actions, which often is inaction, right? If we don't say anything, or today, actually, these days in the communications environment, if we don't allow people to comment on our Facebook, right? Often what happens in crisis is one of the first things companies do is shut down the ability for people to post things to their Facebook wall or to reply on Facebook, or they'll shut down their Twitter account, right? Because the concerns would be flooded with quote unquote negative comments. And I always, in those specific instances, I'll say, we can certainly do that. We have the ability to do that. Just so you know, you therefore block the ability of the people who are supporting you to comment as well. And either, by the way, now and later, we should talk about how employees are often the best tools for a company or even a government agency to use to mitigate risk or deal with a crisis. Groups of stakeholders, depending on the challenge of the issue. Sometimes it's investors, sometimes it's customers, sometimes it's employees. And once again, like social media, it's not something you can start, a relationship you can begin when the crisis happens. It's something that you have to have had and worked on for a long time, or it's just not going to be something you can leverage in a crisis. So for employees, I guess the best way to explain it is to give an example in the real world. I won't give names because I can't, but I'll try to be as provide as much information as useful. So once I was helping a large company deal with a crisis event where they had fired an employee who had been in the military, and this person sued the company for wrongful firing, and was getting a lot of traction on social media. How dare you treat a member of the military like this, etc. It was so media reports, but then also what happened almost immediately was an inundation to the social media sites of that company from other members of the military, current and past, saying, how dare you treat someone like that? So it wasn't just within the media, but it was also on the company's social media platforms, Facebook and Twitter. And as I was saying before, one of the initial reactions or discussed reactions was, should we shut down the ability for people to post things to the Facebook wall, the wall of the company's Facebook page? And so I argued that doing that would not only send the message, as you alluded to earlier, that the company's being evasive, has something to hide, etc. But for me, as someone who always looks for opportunity in these kinds of crises, what it would do, it would block the ability of our supporters, in this case, our employees, to weigh in. So what I suggested and what we finally did was to have the CEO post something on the company Facebook page, acknowledging that this incident had happened, if I'm trying to remember back, it wasn't, had nothing to do with military service, that we, of course, support our members of the military. Lots of members of the military worked at that company. The company was proud of that fact. We also, therefore, posted it to Facebook. We pushed out the statement on a company email, because that's how people still get their information. But we didn't do a media interview, because the idea was there, it would look like we were just trying to sell the company line. In this case, we kept it to employee communications. That's who we were trying to communicate to. Of course, the media have access to our Facebook page. They saw it, and they included the statement from the CEO in their print stories going forward. But more importantly, the employees saw it. And then the employees weighed in on Facebook to the people who were attacking the company about its treatment of someone in the military, saying things like, hold on a second, I served, I'm proud that I served, this company supports me, the company is being described here as not the company I work for, the company being described in the media, that's not this company, this is this company. And then they explained what they did for the company and why they did it, why they worked for this company. And that's what turned the tide. Not what the CEO said, not what we could have said to the media, but what the employees said for us, for themselves, actually, on social media. And that's what turned the tide for the crisis. Something that could have been an actual existential reputational threat to the company actually turned out almost to be a benefit. More people now knew about the company. More people knew that it hired members of the military, even wounded warriors. This company had a strong wounded warrior program. All those things happened because of quote unquote this negative crisis event. And with that example in mind, I do try to approach almost any crisis for a client, or if in the future, if I'm working for in-house with a company, the same way. What's the opportunity here? Not just risk mitigation, but the opportunity for the company to grow. But everyone was at the table. Everyone heard the same basic facts. And I know what the government relations people are telling their contacts. They know what we're doing, in this case, the example I just gave with employee engagement. And therefore, all these audiences are hearing the same kind of message, not a campaign message of the exact same words spoken by everyone like a robot, but in their own way, saying the same message and reaching their audiences the way they reach them, which, depending on the function, could be a phone call, could be a face-to-face meeting. The CEO could do a town hall on that issue, have it recorded and pushed out on Facebook. By the way, I enjoy those kind of what I call bank shot communications. So this is the CEO speaking to the employees, but knowing that other people are listening, right? So although like, and sometimes that's actually the real audience. You're trying to reach the media, but you're reaching them through employee engagement, which sounds counterintuitive, but it's one of my favorite ways to communicate externally, actually, is to communicate internally, knowing that internal communications is now seen by people outside the company.
And up front, it's not a difficult question, but it's a difficult topic, and it's not a gotcha question. I promised at the beginning there wasn't a gotcha question coming. It sort of relates back to that first example you gave. You're there, you're trying to create this policy outcome with this visit, with this through the communication of this visit. But now you're into a really complex set of audiences, and now you're into cultural and language issues and things. So what sort of things are there to bear in mind when you have so many potentially different audiences?
Right. So I think you've hit on a key driver to communications, but also, you're trying to implement a policy or sell a product in multiple places. So I also teach a course on international relations theory at American University here in Washington. And part of the section in that class is something called cultural communications, and to make sure you understand that. And it's a course often taken by not just people who are interested in international relations, but those in business in the private sector as well, who, as you described, have been working overseas or in different countries. Because of course, everything's overseas, right? Because we're the center of everything, which of course is not true. And that's the main thing you learn in cultural communications. So at the end of the day, it's you need to do the same kind of homework that you would need to do if you were in your home country. So, and those kind of drivers don't change. So what's your policy or what's your product, your initiative, your goal, right? Who needs to hear it, see it? Who you're trying to sell it to? Where do they get their information? That is still important. Who's the speaker? Because that can impact it, right? So if it's a policy, is it the president, the Secretary of State or Defense? Is it the CEO? Right? And then number 5, something you could never do in the past is metrics. Did you reach the audience? Did they hear it? Did they buy the product? Did they support the policy? Now you can measure that in a way you just couldn't before because of digital media, not just social media, but website clicks, etc. So overseas, you really do need to understand, if you're in a different country, the culture of that country, to understand the audience that you're trying to reach. A great example of this is when I helped a multinational company, and they were trying to implement an employee engagement initiative across the globe. They had about 100,000 employees spread across multiple countries. And what's odd is that the challenge was that some of those countries, English was the main language. Therefore, people thought we don't have a language issue because everyone speaks English. You'll recognize this from someone who's has been in America. But this particular company had operations, Saudi Arabia or in the Middle East, Asia, but the U.S., the UK, and Australia. So, and the kicker here was actually the challenge was Australia. And because the culture there is not one of individuality and highlighting what they accomplished or talking about what they do at work, which was one of the kind of the themes of this employee engagement initiative. But in Australia, it's much more about the team and about we, the collective group coming together to face a challenge. And therefore, it took time for us to understand that issue and therefore change how we approach the employee engagement for that company in that country. And therefore, the same kind of thing happens elsewhere. The U.S. government faces this challenge on language and culture, on policy stuff all the time, and it fails often on things. it'll do interviews with media in a foreign country in English. Therefore, it's only going to reach the elites. It's not going to reach the main population. Therefore, you need to understand language. If it's in the Middle East and it's Arabic, there, of course, are two kinds of Arabic language spoken. The native Arabic in that particular country and the kind of classical Arabic, and the writing is different as well. So once again, it reaches a different audience. So it always goes back to those main 5 things. What's your policy, your goal, your product? Who's your audience you're trying to reach? Where do they get their information, which is key. And therefore, you need to make sure wherever they get their information, you need to make sure you're there in the manner that that platform is used to being in, whether it's the language, the tone, the images used, if like an infographic on Twitter, and make sure the social platform, Twitter is not, and Facebook aren't the only 2 social media platforms in the world. Where do people get their information is key. One of the key things they teach in this cultural communication section of the class that I teach is in some Asian countries, the idea is that you need to have a kind of a long-term relationship with someone in order to be successful at business. And what that means is, especially for Americans who go someplace, in other words, if we're flying to Asia, we have a goal and we need to accomplish something when we're there, a definable thing. The agreement has to be signed, an announcement made, some sort of tangible thing. When often success for those in Japan and elsewhere is simply what some people refer to as tending the garden, right? Just working that relationship. That in of itself is the goal, to have that kind of relationship. And that over time, you can develop something that turns into what we would define as tangible. Places like India are the same way, where it takes years to get something to happen, partly because of bureaucracy, but also because of culture. So understanding that culture and therefore setting your own expectations accordingly is key to success, or depending on how you do it, failure. Some of the key things are to do your homework, know your audience before you start communicating. Make sure you have a clear goal, whether it's a policy objective or a product that's trying to be sold. Make sure you have that goal forefront, that you're not just communicating to communicate. During crisis communications, try to find the opportunity, and therefore, as you take actions, not just to mitigate the risk, but try to do it with an opportunity in mind as well. Move fast, but always be truthful. Public relations, crisis communications, strategic communications, marketing, whatever you want to do, is not about lying or about spinning the truth. It's about telling the truth in a way your audience understands. If you want to call that spin, fine. I don't see it as that. I see it as giving information and getting it to my audience where they are. Don't forget about all your advocates that you have out there. If you're a company, it's your employees. Be nice to reporters. Don't always call them when you want something. Send them an email or a text or a social media post on a story they've done that has nothing to do with what you're interested in. Just say, hey, great job. That was really interesting. But make sure it's true. Once again, don't lie. The reporters will know it. And last but not least, always be yourself. Whether you're on social media or an email, be transparent, be open, and know that risk is inherent in whatever you're doing. And there is no such thing as the risk-free world. And accept that and act accordingly.
So what I'd like to do now is turn to the Engaging America project, which is quite new. And actually, it's not something that I know a huge amount about, although you've mentioned it before when we've been chatting, and I've looked at the website. So I think it would be really interesting just describe Engaging America, why you've set it up and what you're trying to do with it.
Sure. So about a year and a half ago, about 18 months ago, I went to what anyone who's familiar with Washington think tank events, you would be the typical event here in Washington. So at a nice hotel here in Washington, they brought together an audience of about 250 people in a large conference room. They had a small stage set up at one end with experts, Republican and Democrats, to talk about a report they had done where they had brought Republicans and Democrats together to agree upon a core set of ideas and policies to do what they called, the name of the report was Extending American Power. And the idea was to keep the U.S. engaged in the world. And how does one do that when they saw kind of a vein or the beginnings of a wish to retrench from the U.S. to retrench from the world, to pull back from world engaging with the rest of the world. So everyone on stage was in agreement. They'd worked for a year on this report, had numerous events and dinners and conferences to come together. They'd worked hard to come up with this core set of agreements that everyone could sign on to. And what happens in the past, and what happens with this one as well, was they have this event, they've done the report, and that's it. In this case, the Washington Post wrote an editorial, I think, on it, saying how amazed they were that Republicans and Dems could come together on these issues, and that was it. But there was a paragraph in the executive summary of the report where it said the main challenge for us, the main challenge before us, is for everyone, Republican and Dems, to go forward and engage their particular audiences to get their buy-in. In other words, for Republicans to reach out to Republicans around the country and Democrats to do the same, to make sure that they agree on the need to stay engaged in the world. And so I went to the people who had organized the event and who had written the report, led it, and offered my assistance. How can I help? What, to get the word out? What's the process? And they said there's not one. There's no funding. There's no more idea, because that's what Washington think tanks do. They do the report, they put it out, and that's needed. I'm not saying that's not needed. That needs to happen. These discussions need to take place, but there was no way to have that conversation outside of Washington. So this was not a response, by the way, to the presidential campaign. It's just, this was not in response to the Trump winning. If Hillary Clinton had won the campaign, this would still be needed. So I put together a proposal and have gone ahead and taken action on it, as is my want. So I've launched a website, engagingamericaproject.org. The idea is to take these experts on whatever issue it is, national security, environment, healthcare, whatever it is, take these experts out of Washington or out of, if they're at a university, out of the academic, and get them to audiences that have not been reached before. So don't go to a major metropolitan area. Don't go to Chicago, Los Angeles, place like that, or Pittsburgh or Philadelphia. Go to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Don't go to Denver. Go to Pueblo, Colorado. Go to Lewiston, Maine is another one I want to go to as well. And the idea is not just to educate, inform the audience, but to have these experts, probably actually more importantly than the audience hearing it, have the experts, the quote unquote experts, hear from the audience, and have them therefore change the way they write about these topics for the policymakers here in Washington. It's not that the American people are uninformed. At times they maybe have been misinformed, but maybe not. But maybe they understand it, but in a completely different manner. So a great example is taking an expert on one of the big discussions in Washington right now is expanding the U.S. Navy, and that we need to have 355 ships. That's the goal. Create a 355 ship Navy, up from, I think it's like 286 now. We'd have these discussions in Washington and about the geopolitical need for this, right? We got to balance the rise of China, a resurgent Russia. You know, we need to be everywhere around the globe. That calls for a 355 ship Navy. It costs this much. This is how it's going to help extend American national security, et cetera. But take that expert, and maybe someone who even disagrees with it, but anyway, take them out of Washington to Nebraska, to a small town in Nebraska, maybe not small town, but a town in Nebraska, and have an event there. And not just educate the audience, but have the experts hear from the audience, from people who say things like, oh, no, we understand. So we grow corn in Nebraska. We understand our market is not here. Our market is overseas. We understand that we need to have influence, if not control, over the commons of the oceans so that our products can make it where they need to go. And that for us, it means whether or not the farm continues, whether or not I have money to send my kids to college. So it's not from geopolitical reasons that they understand the need. It's from they need to put food on the table. They need to send their kids to college. And therefore, the experts now have an understanding of this issue they just didn't before. And the people in the audience have an understanding, and maybe and therefore become supporters and advocates in a way they just weren't before. So that one thing is to have these events. Number two is to have these experts do interviews with local radio, TV, and print. Not fight for the national, as everyone does, the national papers. Everyone here in Washington is fighting to get their op-ed in, you know, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or the Financial Times, which is read by, you know, a small but, you know, important sector here in Washington as well. Everyone's fighting for those opportunities. But reach local radio and TV and print in a way that they just haven't heard from experts before, and therefore reach a much broader audience. And number three is the kind of third leg of the stool. Third leg is one more leg after that, the fourth, is this social media component. Taking these think tank policy reports, 20, 30 page reports, and necking them down into 2 or 3 pages of shareable content, understandable, clear, concise, that can be shared not just in person with the audience, but in classrooms, even in high schools around the country. And then fourth is metrics. As I've said before on communications, metrics is key to all this. So with digital tools now, you can measure the audience in a way you couldn't before. And then you could follow that audience over time. So invite people in the audience to join a Facebook group, and follow that audience over time. They went to the event in Nebraska. What did they think of the event? Did they learn anything? Continue to follow up and engage with that audience over time to see if their views have changed, if they understand things, what new issues bother them or concern them. And in that way, move the needle in a real way that actually hasn't been attempted before on these issues. So that's the goal of the Engaging America Project, not exactly an elevator speech, unless it was like a really tall building. But, and I've been talking to multiple people about it. Everyone's in agreement it needs to be done. And we're looking forward to officially launching it in January. But people can go now to the website, engagingamericaproject.org, to see what's there now.
How did we get to this stage? Did people just sort of almost grow apart, that the think tanks and the government are doing their thing and focused on that, and we've lost the ability to communicate? What do you think has got to this point? Because assuming in a positive way, we're trying to return to a point when there's more of a conversation going on.
Right. It's partly returned to I think a past that didn't exist. So I'm not sure it's returned to an era where conversations happened. I think there were some conversations happening on, if you go back to the 50s, early 60s, where we had news programs where this content was discussed. But remember, the programs only lasted 30 minutes. And there wasn't a lot else on to watch. So that's how they got their audience. But I think what it is, it's getting the experts who have always only talked to each other and written for each other in a language, almost all their own. And I think a lot of the people in the U.S. Allow them to do that. So you be the experts, you run this stuff, we're doing our thing out here, and everyone was, I think, comfortable with that. Those days are over because of, I think, in large part because of these digital tools everyone has access to. Everyone gets a say in policy now in a way that just didn't happen in the past. Therefore, we need to reach those audiences where they are. And counterintuitively, even though social media, digital tools are out there, unlike they ever were in the past, the power of in-person engagement is still very real. And I still think the single most powerful way to communicate with someone is literally face-to-face. And therefore, that's why the first leg of the stool are these in-person engagement events. And once that happens, you can then follow up with them on digital as well. And then those people share with their contacts on social media, often some of those people they also know face-to-face, but who may not have been able to come to the event, but know the people who did. So the follow-on impacts of this could be dramatic. But it really is, I think, one of the major goals of this is actually to take the quote-unquote experts out of their comfort zone and have them argue their theses, their ideas to hopefully a skeptical audience. I'm someone who grew up in Texas and understand that the more small town view of things but then have lived in major metropolitan areas ever since. So also understand. So I kind of bridge those two worlds, and maybe that's why this particular thing interested me because I can understand people who want to retrench, and as well as the need to stay engaged in the world.